Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, another video in this. I don't know if it's a series or what the heck it is. A bunch of ideas I've had that are all kind of related because it's this discussion I've been having with other people lately. Talking about game design and incentive versus direction in that game design. I made a video a few days ago talking about the idea that I didn't necessarily like the idea of incentives pushing me in a particular direction, or especially where it becomes simply a matter of like jumping through hoops to get what it is you want. And I remember I was thinking about this a little while ago because as we're talking about like what various games are about, what type of play they incentivize or reward, or they just put in there. I remember back to a couple of videos I did on XP. And the idea that, like in something like older versions of D&D, you don't necessarily need to use the whole treasure and killing XP. You don't need to incentivize those behaviors necessarily. You can use something else. I know I get rocks thrown at me by some purists, but whatever it is that you want to necessarily reward people for or have the game focus on, you can make that the focus of XP, as such as things like completing various missions or whatever, or whatever it happens to be, good role playing or whatnot. And I mentioned kind of in passing in one of those videos and didn't really explain it. Well, you have to be careful not to railroad people. And what I meant by that was that sometimes when you incentivize other things such as completing the mission, or maybe even just role playing, maybe role playing your character in a particular way, you can inadvertently, or by design, railroad players into performing certain behaviors simply because they know that's what they're supposed to be doing in the game. I had a discussion with some of the people today talking about I played in games where I tried to role play my character a little bit more, and I don't believe it was a genre mismatch. I really don't. But it was made clear to me by the game master and some of the other players that like what I really was supposed to be doing was something else. In this particular case, I was supposed to be following the mission and killing things and what have you. And so they kind of gently or not so gently pushed me in the direction that they wanted me to go. They railroaded my behavior in that manner. And that's a whole different talk about like what is the game really about, and before you actually sit down and start play, you have to be really clear about what we're actually going to be doing in this game. But now that I've had this really long, rambling introduction, which was what I was hoping was going to be a short video, one of the things that came up in this discussion was actually Jason Dark Age, a roleplay game, as a member of this discussion group. He talked about things like in Hollow Earth Expedition, in the Ubiquity powered games, the idea that you have things like motivations and flaws and archetypes, and this is an informative and directive piece of your character sheet. It tells you, okay, this is a rule. This is something that you're going to do. You're going to play your character like this because you're supposed to play your character like this. It is a direction. It does translate into a little bit of reward. I mean, one of the things that you get rewarded for in Ubiquity games, you can get 1 experience point for good role play. What that is, that's a little bit subjective, which I kind of like rather than really objective criteria. However, you can also get style points for behaving in ways that line up with your flaw and your motivation and all that sort of thing. But beyond that, and probably to at least to people like me, more important than that, when I read that, it was just like, oh, this is a rule. You're supposed to behave according to your flaw, according to your motivation, according to your archetype. It gave you like a prompt. And one of the interesting things that Jason mentioned in his little, as we were talking, was the idea that he played with the same group of people, and they played 5th edition D&D, which had, in the beginning of that game, you have, I forget all the exact things, but there's ties and bonds and pretty much motivations. There's like 4 or 5 things that you list about your character that kind of informs like what kind of person they are, and can be prompts to role play. And he played that with that very same group. He played Basic Fantasy role-playing game, and he found that these particular gamers had an easier time role-playing when they had these prompts in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and didn't role-play quite so much when they played Basic Fantasy role-playing game. Now, to somebody like Jason and I, we would have just role-played anyway. I'm not saying these people were bad gamers. I'm saying it's useful to have that prompt, and I've certainly enjoyed having that prompt on my character sheet. Playing Ubiquity-based games or something like that, where it tells me, here's I wrote it down myself. What is my character like? But it's a prompt, and we actually have discussions about like where does the character develop from there. All the discussions we have about our characters afterwards as we discover who they are and they become fleshed out. Because something like my characters in all the Ubiquity games I'm playing, they're more the sum total of those motivations and flaws. but it's a direction. There is some incentive involved in there, but the direction to me is more at least it's more satisfying to me that the game gives you directions. There are games that have very prescriptive natures, and just some of the games that I've examined recently, things like Tech Noir. It doesn't necessarily have mechanics that will tell you you cannot do something, or however. It will tell you flat out, this is a noir game. If you're creating a character that's going to be some badass that's going to go in and shoot up the gang lord's stronghold, and you're kind of circumvent what the game is actually supposed to be about, you're doing it wrong. You're making the wrong kind of character. You are, in a sense, playing the game wrong. In Circle of Hands by Ron Edwards, he talks about, these are ways that you should play this game, and these are other ways that you should not play this game. If you're playing this game like, X, Y, and Z, you are playing it wrong. The mechanics themselves don't necessarily stop you from doing that. There's an actual prescription in the game, and those are just two games that talk about. There's a whole bunch where it's more direction rather than mechanics that enforce or guide you in a certain direction. And one of the things I was thinking, about as we're talking about various other games, actually, CGA, Complex Games Apologist, was bringing up, somehow we got on the subject of like Momentum and Doom in 2D20 Conan, or I think it's Momentum and Risk, or whatever the heck it is, in the Star Trek version of 2D20. The idea that there's a certain point where these mechanics are in place, and the game itself is actually showing you how to play it. Rather than just be prescriptive and saying you should play this game in this particular manner, you will play with a flaw, or you should not play a character like this in Circle of Hands or in Tech Noir. Instead, the very mechanics of the game, it's not so much an incentivization. They do incentivize to a certain extent some behaviors, but the game is pretty much showing you how to play it via the mechanics that are in place there. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but it was really kind of an interesting look at how various games, when they're supposed to be about something, how do they tell you? How do they show you what you're supposed to be doing? Because at the end of the day, this is kind of well, we're talking about techniques and what have you. There's an idea that a game designer has. They have this idea of, this is how I want people to play this particular game. This is what the game is about. It's their brainchild. And they play test it with other people. But at some point they release it to the rest of the world. And sometimes people discover more about that game than the creator ever knew about that game. And they end up understanding the game better than the creator. Something that Anthony brought up, which I thought was pretty thought-provoking. However, at the same time, it's incumbent upon this game designer. They have to figure out, well, how am I going to get people to play this game the way they're supposed to be playing it? And sometimes it's very prescriptive, and there's directions, and sometimes they put in incentives. I personally gravitate more towards the direction rather than the incentive, regardless of whether or not the incentives are there. I've had experiences in playing Ubiquity-based games online, in Hangouts, and Hangouts can be really clunky. When every once in a while I wanted to do something based on the flaw, the motivation, or something very Philippe, or something very Montgomery, or whatever character I happen to be playing at the moment, and it got missed. Sometimes it's just because Hangouts is clunky, sometimes it's because the scene moved on, and occasionally I would get a little upset for a second. Not really upset, but just like, gee, I wish I had the opportunity to role play that. And I thought about it. It wasn't because I wanted these style points. It wasn't because I wanted the reward, or the reward at the end of the game for good role play. It's because I simply wanted to role play that character, and I stepping in and inhabiting that character. And in cases, especially like the one shot I did with Montgomery, I was handed a character with flaws and motivations and whatnot. I enjoyed getting into that character, and I simply wanted to role play. It wasn't about getting more style points. The incentives were there in the game, and they're there in other games as well. But to me, what floats my boat is actually doing. I'd rather look at the direction of what I'm supposed to do. I'm more motivated by that direction of wanting to play the game correctly and wanting to step into character than I am about getting some kind of incentive for doing it. What's your take on all that? Kind of a confusing video, but hopefully you understood where I was going.